Hello and welcome. I am Ejaz Haider and you're watching Indus Special. The US Special Representative for Afghanistan Reconciliation, Ambassador Zalmay Khalilzad, was in Islamabad yesterday and met the Prime Minister Imran Khan. Ambassador Khalilzad, since been appointed as Special Representative on September 5 this year, has also had meetings with the Taliban reps in Doha. His visit was preceded by a letter from US President Trump to Prime Minister Khan seeking Islamabad's help in getting the Taliban to the negotiating table and bringing a closure to America's longest and seemingly unwinnable war in Afghanistan. Ironically, this letter, presumably drafted by more balanced and experienced minds, was succeeded by some tweets against Pakistan by Mr. Trump that can charitably only be described as brazen and irresponsible. That said, it's clear that Mr. Trump does want to get out of Afghanistan. Lieutenant General Kenneth McKenzie, the next commander of the US Central Command, at his confirmation hearing said much the same. The US needs a closure and Pakistan has a role to play. The question is, what's the quid for this quo? For that, we have with us Rahimullah Yousufzai, a resident editor of the news in Peshawar, Zahid Hussain, a writer and journalist in Islamabad, and we will later also be joined by Dawood Azmi, who works at the BBC and is based in London. So let me kick off with Rahimullah Yousufzai here. And the question is the US really serious about pushing this to a real peace process for the first time?
I think the US was never that serious concerning finding a political solution of the Afghan issue, because, there had been half-hearted attempts, and the US was always telling Taliban that you have to talk to the Afghan government. Now the US itself has become involved, become engaged with the Taliban, and they already held 3 rounds of talks in Qatar. So I think that there is a lot of seriousness. They know that it's not going to be easy. That's why they are seeking support of all
but you agree that this time they're serious?
I think they're serious. They are facing real challenges in Afghanistan. I think that there has been a lot of pressure also on the Trump administration that for how long the U.S. forces will remain in Afghanistan and for how long they are going to pay the bills concerning the Afghan war and the Afghan reconstruction. So
okay.
There is this serious approach, and that's why, this time Zalmay Khalilzad is visiting 8 countries,
yes,
including Pakistan.
Because they're basically saying that there's got to be a regional solution. It cannot simply be an Afghanistan solution.
I think that is what they say visibly, but the U.S. will still like to maintain control. So
Okay.
They want to be in the leading role, but they also are seeking help, not only of Pakistan, but also of Russia, China, the Arab countries, all of them. So, this in a way is a US-led peace process. We all say Afghan-led, Afghan-owned, but in reality it's an US-led, initiative. And, the US has to decide concerning the Taliban demands. Number 1, withdrawal of all foreign forces. That only the US can decide, not anybody else. And then the other demands also concern the Afghan government. So the Afghan government also should become involved at some stage in these talks.
Now, that's very important, and I'm going to come to that. But tell me, how significant in this backdrop is the Moscow process?
I think that the Moscow process, the Russian initiative was important. Russia is still, one of the stakeholders. But as I said earlier, the U.S. will not let Russia take the leading role. So the U.S. eventually agreed to take part in the last conference in Moscow after having boycotted the earlier conferences. But you look at the representations of the U.S. at that conference. It was only at the embassy level in Moscow.
That's
and,
correct.
you know, the Afghan government also followed suit, and they did not send an official delegation. And India also the same. So these three countries, in a way, were not going fully with the Moscow process. That's why, you know, even though it was important, and, you know, everybody agreed that there is no military solution at this conference in Moscow, but it cannot go ahead unless the U.S., you know, cooperates. And the U.S. will not cooperate with any Russian initiative.
Let me take this to Ejaz Hussain. Ejaz Hussain, my question to Rahimullah Yousufzai was whether the U.S. is serious. Now, I'm going to ask you, do you think Pakistan also agrees that the U.S. is serious and Pakistan itself is serious about this?
Well, it's very clear that that this time around, the United States is very serious about it in pursuing a political settlement in Afghanistan. We have seen in the under previous administration, there has been a lot of talk about the possibility of peace negotiations, but they were never serious about it. They were not clear strategy. This time, they have appointed a special representative, and the appointment of Zalmay Khalilzad is also very significant because he's an old Afghan hand. He knows Afghanistan very well. Because he's an American of Afghan origin. So, and his mandate is that to reach some kind of deal within a stipulated time.
So when you say reach some kind of deal, are you saying that the contours of that deal are not very clear at this stage?
No, not at all. But basically, two rounds of meeting had already taken place, and the third round is here for the third round of meeting in Doha. Some positive development has taken place. The first thing that, yes, obviously, Afghan Taliban always wanted to have a direct negotiations with Americans, and this time they have actually agreed to it, the U.S. And so some of the there has been some kind of development which has been described by Taliban as trust-building measures, which is also very important. Now, still actually there's a lot to be done before a structured and formal negotiation could be started. But what I'm hearing actually that there has been some move forward, and this time this round of talks is going to be really important. But the problem is that it's not so easy because the Afghan situation is very, very complex. Zalmay Khalilzad is not only have to negotiate with Taliban, but also actually have to take on board Afghan government. Yes, actually President Ghani has given a tacit approval for a direct negotiation between Taliban and American, because that is a shift in his earlier position that the solution should be Afghan-led and Afghan-owned process should be there. But there is strong reservation. In Geneva meeting conference, which was held last month, he came out very clearly in saying that only successful negotiation can only be taking place by the Afghan government, between Afghan government and Taliban. So
isn't that the stick point? Because if we go back to, for instance, when Hamid Karzai was the president, and there was the sense that negotiations could begin, they made shipwreck on the rocks of the Taliban insistence that they be called the Islamic Emirate of Afghanistan. Now, during the Moscow process, the Taliban statement, and I think if my count is right, 62 or 64 times they used the term Islamic Emirate of Afghanistan. So they are clearly indicating that they are going to negotiate with the US, and the negotiation will be with reference to a timetable for US withdrawal from Afghanistan. They are not going to talk to Kabul, which they consider as a puppet of the US.
Well, actually, there has not been any flexibility so far in Taliban's position that they were not going to talk to Kabul government. But if the negotiations move forward with the Americans, and there could be some stage where Taliban may agree that Kabul government should also sit on the negotiating table, but not now. As you just referred about Mr. Karzai's objection, but at that point, if you know that Karzai was able to sabotage the talks, and after that, for 2 years, we saw that there was nothing, no contact between Americans and the Taliban. Now, but the situation has changed. This time, President Ghani did not object to the negotiation, and I think probably it has become, probably a very insignificant issue that whether what do they call themselves, Taliban, whether they call it Islamic Emirates or not. That issue has been put back actually, and there's not.
Okay. Let me throw this to Rahimullah Yousufzai. Rahimullah Yousufzai, my question stands. The Taliban are very clear that they are negotiating a timetable for the withdrawal of U.S. forces. Now, Zalmeh's mission is to make some kind of deal happen, and it appears to me that he's a man in a hurry. Now, we have got a man in a hurry, and we have got an insurgent force which is very clear about what they want. So how are these two positions, or how can these two positions be squared?
You know, Zalmeh Khalilzad was a man in a hurry when he held the earlier rounds of talk with Taliban and then reported to Kabul whatever had been discussed. He was saying he's looking for a period of 5 to 6 months, and he meant before the elections for president in Afghanistan. But I think after the statement by President Ashraf Ghani in Geneva, in which he is saying that let there be elections first, a new president, a new government with a new mandate for peace and reconciliation, and then talks can be held, and he has already named a 12-member committee. Ironically, you know, one of the members who was named, Munib, he said he was not even consulted, and his name was put in this negotiating team. But these kind of things happen, in all part of the world. Now, the Ashraf Ghani's stand is, I think, very different than what the Americans want. Yeah. They wanted a quick solution. And that's why Zalmeh Khalilzad was saying that we want to accomplish this in 5 to 6 months. That is no longer possible, I think. The Afghan government will oppose it. They have opposed the formation of an interim government. They want the elections to be held first, and they want a new mandate. And then Ashraf Ghani also said, surprisingly, that any agreement reached with Taliban will take 5 years to be implemented. And many people said that he wants to be in control. He is seeking re-election. He is hoping that he will win again. He will be the president, and he will lead the negotiation.
Okay. Zaid Hussain, what exactly are the Americans asking us? And before you respond, I have a couple of points in front of me. Earlier today, a presser by the Director General of Inter-Services Public Relations, and he said Afghanistan cannot look after their borders properly. We want the US to exit Afghanistan as a friend of Pakistan and Afghanistan, and not on a bad note. So what exactly are the Americans asking us, and how are we responding to that?
Well, actually, there's Americans have always asked Pakistan, or have been insisting that Pakistan has influence over our Taliban, and they could bring them on negotiating table. Mm-hmm. Things have changed a little bit. Previously, there was actually no clear plan or strategy before the Americans. So I think probably it was kind of a stalemate between Pakistan and America on that issue. Now, actually, since there has been some movement, it seems that Pakistan is already cooperating. We have seen actually 3 or 4 men Taliban leaders have been.
But here's the thing. In DGISPR's presser, he also said that there was a time we used to have control over the Taliban, but that is not the case now. I mean, we still can do certain things, but we cannot. I mean, he was implying that we can't do everything.
Well, of course, I mean, if anybody is saying that Pakistan has total command over Taliban, it is wrong. Taliban may have good relations with Pakistan, and in a course of time, when Taliban have gained some ground and have been successful on the battleground, their dependence on Pakistan has declined tremendously.
Okay.
To say that Pakistan is in any way in a position to bring them on negotiating table and also get them to agree to something is, I think, probably is not correct. And this thing actually Pakistan has been conveying, and I think probably there's a problem with Pakistan's policy also, because in the past we have seen that giving some kind of impression that they are only there, they are a player in the game who can bring back Taliban or who have some kind of control over Taliban. And now actually there's a greater understanding of that is not possible.
Okay.
At this point in time, what Pakistan can do certainly can persuade them. They still, when we say that they do not have full control over Taliban, but they certainly have some influence over the Taliban.
They certainly have some influence. Okay. Thank you so much, Ejaz Hussain, for being with me and giving your insights on this. Rahimullah Yousufzai, the same question. What exactly is the degree of control? Because the Americans have also been constantly saying this, and they insist that the Taliban leadership resides in Pakistan.
You know, because we were able to bring them to the table once in the past in July 2015 in Murray.
Yes.
And that was the first time there was a face-to-face meeting between the Afghan Taliban and the Afghan government. Somehow the impression has been created that we can do all this again, and we are not doing, enough towards that end. So this is an impression which was created because of Pakistan's, initiative. Taliban also went to Urumqi, Xinjiang, in China once, and they held a face-to-face meeting with the Afghan government. Again, I think Pakistan played a role along with China. So that is the reason that everybody thinks that, we can manage this. By saying that earlier we had complete control or more control, and now that control, is no longer there, I think we are, saying something which we never did in the past. The impression is very strong, I must say, in Washington, in London, in Kabul, and in many other world capitals. The fact remains that those Taliban leaders who are still in Pakistan, they are actually vulnerable to Pakistani pressure. We have arrested many of them in the past. In fact, I remember in the early days of the American invasion, we captured some Afghan Taliban leaders and some Al-Qaeda people, and we delivered them to the U.S. and also to the Afghan government. So that's why they think that we should do this again. Now, we can do this again by arresting more of them, keeping them in jail, expelling them. That's what the Americans want. But the problem is that if we do that, I don't think that any Taliban military commander or the political commission in Qatar or anybody else, would be happy about it, or they will be pressured into talking to the Afghan government. That will not happen, I think. So that's why Pakistan has been pleading that, we should not use coercion. We should try to use...
Okay, but Rahimullah Yousufzai, one of the sticking points here is that whether we have the influence on the Taliban and to what degree we can get them to do what the U.S. ask is from us. You earlier said that because we managed to get them to Murray, to the negotiating table, an impression has been created that they are here. So are you saying that, one, the influence is not that much, and secondly, that Taliban leadership does not reside in Pakistan anymore?
No, I am saying that maybe there were more Taliban leaders here earlier, and many of them have left. Some have gone to Qatar. We know about that. Some have gone to Iran. They keep coming and going. And many have shifted to Afghanistan because now they control more territory in Afghanistan. And, in fact, the shadow governor for Helmand, Mullah Abdul Manan, who was killed a few days ago in a U.S. drone strike, he was among those who had shifted to Afghanistan.
Hold that thought, Rahimullah Yousufzai. I also have Dawood Azmi, who's a journalist based in London. Welcome to the program, Mr. Azmi. What do you make of this Khalilzad mission? Before you joined us, we were talking about the fact that A, the US seems to be serious this time about negotiating. B, it's Zalmay Khalilzad's mission to get the job done. And 3, he seems to be a man in a hurry. And 4, that President Ashraf Ghani seems to think that perhaps the Americans are jumping ahead of the curve.
Well, the war is, has been going on for 17 years. But the Americans didn't have a peace process or a peace strategy. The whole focus was on war, on military strategy. Correct. So this is the first time in the past 17 years that the US has come up with a peace plan, with a strategy for peace, or with the settlement through negotiations. So this is something new. And secondly, it's not only about the US and Afghan government talking to the Taliban. The US is engaging all the main regional players. So that's the reason that Zalmay Khalilzad is not only visiting Pakistan, he will also visit Moscow, Uzbekistan, Turkmenistan, and Qatar and all the Arab
because they're talking about a regional solution.
So there are 3 dimensions when it comes to war and peace in Afghanistan. One is local, the consensus within the Afghan government or those factions which are part of the Afghan government. That's important, that's needed. Second is the regional dimension. And there are many regional players who can disrupt the peace process, who can prolong the peace process, and who can become an obstacle. So those countries can be Pakistan, Iran, Russia, and some Arab countries. They can also help and they can also create problems. And the dimension is the international element, which involves the US and NATO. So it seems that the US, for the first time, is serious about resolving the conflict in Afghanistan through negotiations. So that's again a new element that we have been witnessing.
So Dawood Azmi, you're absolutely right. I agree with you. But here's the problem. The Taliban, for instance, if you look at the Moscow process and the statement that the Taliban issued, and I think it was like 62 or 64 times that they used the phrase Islamic Emirate of Afghanistan, implying very clearly that they are the legit government. And when they are negotiating with the Americans, they're very clear that they are negotiating a timetable for withdrawal. So they are keeping the government in Kabul out of this process. So would you agree with me?
Initially, the government in Kabul is out of the process, and they have given a reason for that. The reason is that the withdrawal of foreign forces is an issue for the United States, not for the Afghan government. So they are talking with the US about the major issues, what they call the major issues. The first major issue for them is the timetable for the withdrawal of foreign forces from Afghanistan. Second is the removal of names from UN sanctions list and US sanctions list. This is again a matter for the United States. Third is the issue of prisoner release. So the Afghan government has thousands of Taliban prisoners, but they also need the agreement of the US government to reach some sort of an arrangement to release these prisoners. And the US is also holding some Taliban prisoners. Some of them are in Guantanamo, some are inside Afghanistan.
But the large percentage of the prisoners are now in Afghanistan government's custody, not the US custody. There are some, but primarily the numbers are now with the Afghan government.
I was coming to that. That is the first phase of the talks. So in the second phase, the Taliban have to talk to the Afghan government. As you rightly said, most of the prisoners are held by the Afghan government. And they are running the prisons. They are in charge of prisons. So they have to talk to the Afghan government. When it comes to the constitutional amendments, the Taliban have to talk to the Afghan government because they are a party, they are a power. They have a say in what is going on in Afghanistan and how the future of Afghanistan should be. And thirdly, when it comes to the implementation of the peace process or peace agreement, there's again an issue for the Afghan government to implement or partly implement. So in the second phase, the negotiations will move to Afghanistan, or it will become the negotiations between different Afghan sides, which includes the Taliban, the Afghan government, and other political forces and parties within Afghanistan. So there will be the second phase. What we are seeing now is the initial phase, the first phase. And Khalilzad has already said that the US is talking to the Taliban to prepare grounds for the intra-Afghan dialogue, meaning the Taliban sitting with the Afghan government. That will come.
Do you think,
when,
okay, that's a very important point. Do you think this is the US ask for Pakistan to get the Taliban to sit with the government in Kabul once the preparatory stage is over?
Well, Pakistan is a very important player for a couple of reasons. It has influence over the Taliban, if not control of the Taliban. Pakistani officials have in the past said many times that they have influence, they have contacts, and the former advisor to former Pakistani Prime Minister Sartaj Aziz openly said in Washington a couple of years ago that the Taliban leadership is in Pakistan and we can put pressure on them because their families...
But Rahimullah Yousufzai just said to me that given the territory that they control in Afghanistan, most of the leaders are now in Afghanistan.
Well, we don't know how many are inside Afghanistan or outside Afghanistan, but there are certainly a number of Taliban leaders who are outside Afghanistan. There's a fact that a number of their leaders are inside Afghanistan, but a number of them are outside Afghanistan. And Pakistani officials have publicly said that. And Mullah Akhtar Mansoor was killed in Pakistan, and many Taliban
but he was coming from Iran.
Were imprisoned.
But he was coming from Iran. But here's my last question, Dawood Azmi, because I got to wrap this up also. Are you optimistic about this?
Well, as I said earlier, that this is the first time that the US is serious about resolving the conflict peacefully. This is something new that didn't exist before, and that gives a lot of hope. And I am hopeful that something has started. But I don't know how much time would it take. There will be many problems. There will be many complexities.
And there will be many spoilers also. And there will be many spoilers also.
Yes. Of course, within Afghanistan, within the region, and internationally. And then the insurgent groups like Al-Qaeda and ISIS is also against
also another factor. So thank you so much, Dawood Azmi, for being on the program. Let me quickly, before I wrap up this segment, go to Rahimullah Yousufzai with the same question. Rahimullah Saab, are you optimistic about the process?
You know, I will say I'm more optimistic than the past.
Okay.
But I'm not fully optimistic that, something dramatic, something big will happen. Because, the Taliban have to also tell their rank and file that we are talking, we are achieving something, whatever we want to achieve through the war, we can also achieve through the talks. That is very important for Taliban because, the fighters, the military commanders hold the key in the decision-making of Taliban. Taliban showed earlier this year during the Eid ceasefire that, their rank and file listens to the leadership. So they had a very complete and disciplined ceasefire.
Absolutely,
so
that was yeah, that's right, that's right.
So I think that's very important for Taliban to show some, achievement. If they can get their prisoners released, if the names are removed from the UN Security Council blacklist, these kind of things, that will be a plus point for the Taliban leadership to proceed.
Okay. Thank you so much, Rahimullah Yousufzai, for giving us our insights. Is this all too little, too late? This is something which one has to see, obviously. And there is a sense, as the analysts on my program said, that this is the preparatory stage, and there are going to be spoilers. There are spoilers inside Afghanistan. There are also regional spoilers. And, of course, the fact that the Taliban, up until this point, have not budged from their original position that they do not want to talk to the government in Kabul. On this note, we're going to take a short break, and when we come back at the other end of the break, we will discuss the protests in France. Stay tuned. Welcome back to Indus Special. After some tough talk at home and then at the G20 in Buenos Aires, French President Emmanuel Macron has caved in to the protesters and abandoned the fuel tax rise that has sparked more than 3 weeks of violence. Just a day earlier, after announcing a 6-month freeze on the eco tax, Macron said it was dropping, the government said it was dropping the measure from 2019 budget. What happened? To discuss this, we have with us Ambassador Uluç, a former Turkish ambassador to France, Van Megredetchian, a French political analyst and journalist based in Paris. Let me begin with the ambassador. Ambassador, what exactly happened? I mean, of course, there are protests when there are price hikes, but this kind of protest and also the violence on the streets of Paris and elsewhere, how does one look at that?
It's in the character of the French people in reality, because when I was ambassador in Paris, I visited several times Mr. Sarkozy, who then was the Minister of Interior, and he told me simply that the French people used to be in the streets to protest and in the same time to ask for their rights to be fulfilled. And that the Turkish citizens were too passive not to intervene with this procedure. And then he asked me whether the Turkish citizens living in France would also go in the same line. So there is, this is one part of the character. The other part of the French character is that we call it esprit de contradiction. It's the French people go always against what they choose in the beginning. Mm-hmm. 3-4 months afterwards, immediately they change their mind and they start protesting the government and the authorities altogether. So this is what happens this time too. The government, Macron, in reality, was he really a president-elect or a president elected by chance or by the permission of the circumstances in France? This is yet to be discussed as well. Well, if I enlarge a little bit the scope of my view, I can say the next thing.
Okay.
Yes.
Okay. Let me go to Van, and I hope that Van can hear us now. I was trying to figure out why this movement became violent. There was protest, which was non-violent, but then, of course, we saw the kind of violence on the streets of Paris. What exactly happened? And now, of course, it's not just about the fuel hike. It's also about other economic measures that President Macron took and which haven't really, presumably, gone down well with the people.
Ejaz, let me first of all tell you what's going on right now in Paris and in different parts of France, in the major big cities. Okay. Most of the schools this morning have been shut forcibly by the students. The students have joined this movement officially as of this week. The young students from the ages of 15 until even in the universities and the schools, 150 universities and schools have been shut due to the protests this morning in Paris, Bordeaux, in Marseille, in Lyon, in all the major French cities. The schools are shut and the students are meeting, gathering around schools and organizing themselves for the upcoming protest of Saturday. And they want to join the movement called the Yellow Vests. The Yellow Vests, who have been protesting now for 4 weeks. Now, usually you might know that in France, usually protests start by the strong unions, what the French call the syndicates.
Yes.
The unions who start these protests have so far been silent about what's going on. This time around, as a matter of fact, this movement, the protest, the anger on the streets, didn't start by the union. The movement started by people who came together in different parts of France, usually outside cities. They gathered around in little towns and villages and started protesting on major highways, wearing the yellow vests. These movements, when they started gathering in major cities, they started having clashes with the police. Instead of the police making sure peaceful protests are protected, for some reason, due to violence on both sides, there has been continuing violence on the streets every time there is a protest. And whether the president and the prime minister, they decided this week that they will back down from a tax hike. This is not working because the issue here at hand in France today, the tax hike was just one of the reasons of the anger on the streets.
Okay, on that note, Van, our sense here is, and correct me if I'm wrong, that the protesters represent France's squeezed middle incomes, which are too high for full welfare benefits, but too low to make ends meet. And they are angry at Macron's early tax cuts for the better off. Is that sense correct?
Listen, that's a very good question, Ejaz. It's a very good question, which points to the core of what is going on in the everyday television media debates on French television channels. For the past 2 weeks, people have been trying to make sense of what are the exact demands of the people on the protesters. Most of the protesters want less taxes, and at the same time they want the services that they have, and they want more services to be given to the underprivileged, to those who are in need, to those who are unemployed. Don't forget, France has a very, very high unemployment rate compared to other European countries. The problem here also, to understand this, President Macron, when he first became president, he was seen as the hope in France. He was seen as the a centrist who was going to stop putting more taxes on the French people, who was going to modernize the economy and get people to find jobs, reform the French economy, the French system, and not impose taxes. Instead, what the people are angry about is that instead of helping the economy, free the economy, and what they are seeing is they are seeing more and more taxes on them in the name of the environment, in the name of different political agendas that the president and his party have been pursuing for a while now. So there is a conflict of interest, definitely, but there is a big divide between people living in urban centers and people living outside the cities. There is a big divide between the rural parts of France and the cities. A lot of people in the cities, until today, a lot of people in the cities are looking at the protesters as if these protesters come from another country, as if these protesters have concerns that they don't share with them, that they don't understand. This is why there is a lot of difficulty today, even by journalists, by writers, by people who are following this story, to understand what is going on, really.
Ambassador Olej, you heard Van try to explain to us what the issue is. Do you agree with that?
Yes, it was a good analysis in the end. But I like to add a few points to that. First of all, as you know, particularly in the Western world, and to start with France, the populism and to be against the foreigners in those countries is increasing more and more. And behind this, you find the economic reasons. And in the beginning, Macron was a hope for that because his speech was liberal as much as social, leftist, and he was a hope for the future. But in the end, actually, Macron has a percentage of 23% only behind him. This means that those who have voted as somebody who would save them from this poverty are not satisfied at all, and they're willing that the government is changed. But they cannot succeed in this field because it's not easy to change the government, and in France, the presidents are quite powerful vis-à-vis the parliament, and in the same time, they have a less saying on the government as well. Now, actually, this problem, this uprising started in an innocent way, but with the interference of different circles, it has become something which the government can no more control. And in that
so are you saying, Ambassador, are you saying that now this is a much bigger problem for President Macron?
Indeed. Not only President Macron, but the president has a big problem actually with the prime minister as well. Because don't forget that the tax hike has started with the decision of the prime minister, and he asked for a suspension of the tax hike for 6 months. That is, yesterday after the government meeting, the president all of a sudden has declared that in 2019 there will be no tax hike anymore, and it's not a 6 months, but an eternal.
But the problem is that lowering the taxes and also increasing welfare are two conflicting aims. But let me go back to Tariq Shakoi here. What is your sense? It's become bigger than just the fuel hike problem, and it now sort of encompasses the entire economic framework of the Macron government. And do you think that this particular crisis is going to end in a few days or a couple of weeks, or it will become a bigger problem for President Macron?
Yes, I think it's going to be definitely a bigger problem for President Macron, because there was an accumulation of mistakes that have been done to handle this situation. First of all, the silence of President Macron since the beginning of the crisis has been badly perceived by the Yellow Vest protesters, because they saw that as as some kind of snubbing, as some sort of belittling of their movement. So the movement now is much bigger and has gone beyond its initial demands of removing that tax hike. Another problem is the fact that the mainstream media in France has been portraying the demonstrators in very bad light, and they have constantly smeared them and put them into a negative portrayal and negative coverage. And this movement, because of the Facebook, because of the social media, they could definitely gain more hearts and minds within the French population. And this is why now all the indicators and all the surveys that have been produced show that they have at least 70% approval within the French people. So this is not just a normal movement. It's widespread. It has workers, farmers, truck drivers, students, teachers, doctors.
But interestingly, what we have seen is that if you look at the profile, there are people from ultra left also and from ultra right also, but at both ends, the political parties have not really been able to capture the sentiment. It's still more leaderless, which obviously seems to be both its strength as well as its weakness.
Absolutely, you are totally correct. But let me just highlight that this is exactly the paradox of Mr. Macron's political strategy, because he has risen because he has tried to sweep away existing political parties and reject the traditional intermediaries like the labor unions. So now these parties have gone back and let him handle the situation alone, and this is not looking really good. So what happens is, like, yes, it's true that there are some people from the left, from the extreme left and the extreme right, who try to gain some momentum out of this. But this is a very decentralized movement. This is a movement that has no head, that has no basically like a center of gravity, which makes it even more more problematic for the status quo.
Okay. Thank you so much, Tariq Shafii, giving us your insight. Thank you also to the ambassador. And let me, before I wrap up, go back to Van on this. Now, Van, obviously, the Yellow Vests aren't the sans-culottes of the past. But the sense that this is likely to grow bigger, does that mean we're looking at new elections or the political ouster of President Macron, or is that too alarmist?
Just very good question as well. Let me just try to explain what might happen in the next few days. The unions, the labor unions, and most unions that represent different groups in France, like the labor unions, different labor unions, farmer unions, the police unions, these groups are like as they constitute a power in France. They are as the fourth branch of government in France. Whenever there is a political debate, they are the ones running the political debate in the country. And these unions today, the farmers, the labor unions, even the police unions, have called for strikes and joining the protests this weekend. Just can you can imagine the scale of the protests, where we're going to go as of tomorrow, as of Saturday. All major museums that work throughout the week in Paris have announced this morning that they will be closing their doors this Saturday to avoid the violence getting into the museums. Because until today, the police have not found a way to contain the protests and to protect them in a peaceful manner. So the protests are getting bigger, and a lot of support is coming from right and left. I agree with your previous speaker when they said there is a sense of no leadership in this movement, and this is what it's giving it the freedom to push back. But you can be from the right, you can be from the left, you can be from the far right, from the far left. They won't be agreeing with each other, but in this movement, people are finding agreement, which is they think that the living conditions in France are becoming very difficult. The purchasing power of every French, normal, regular, day-to-day French are getting lower. The purchasing power is getting weakened, and this is the fight is about this.
But here's the thing, Van. Here's the thing. If ultimately, if this is going to be a political course of action for the movement, a movement that's kind of not with leaders. It's not it's a political movement, but it also has a non-political character. But going forward, someone will have to take the lead. And who do you think that might be?
Well, what the Yellow Vests are calling for is in new elections, new democratic fair elections that they think would put the questions on major issues that how the country could move forward. Anybody could take power. Anybody could come to power. The problem in the French political system is that usually in presidential elections, a lot of times the presidents are elected on the basis of choosing the better of the two worst candidates. If you have two bad candidates, well, you're going to choose the one that is less bad than the other one. So it is very difficult to see who will benefit from this. But there is a real potential that these movements get bigger, but no clear results at the hindsight.
Okay. Thank you so much, Van, for the program and giving us your insights. This is all for today. The French situation, obviously, despite the backing down of the Macron government, seems to be swelling and becoming bigger, bringing into its ambit not just the fuel hike, but also other issues of economy, purchasing power, and lowering living standards. We are going to wrap up here and say goodbye.